There is a version of you that chases people who have already stopped looking back. There is a version of you that explains yourself to people who never actually asked and never actually cared. There is a version of you that begs quietly, constantly for approval from rooms that were never going to give it no matter what you did. And there is a stronger, quieter version of you standing just behind all of that, waiting, that has already figured out the truth ancient philosophers built entire schools of thought around. Silence is not weakness. Silence is the loudest thing you own. Today you are going to learn exactly how to use it, through 3 unbreakable rules and 9 true stories of people who lived by them. Never chase. Never beg. Never explain. Say those 3 sentences to yourself right now, because by the end of this, they are going to mean something completely different than they do at this exact moment. Almost every person alive has, at some point, chased someone who wasn't chasing back, begged for something that should have been given freely, or explained a decision to someone who had already made up their mind before the explanation ever started. These are not rare mistakes reserved for the unusually insecure. They are close to universal, which is exactly why the men who built Stoic philosophy spent so much time writing about them. Epictetus, who spent part of his life enslaved with no control over his own body, understood better than almost anyone in history the difference between what is actually yours to command and what will only ever slip further away the harder you grasp for it. Marcus Aurelius, ruling the most powerful empire on earth, still had to remind himself daily not to seek the approval of people whose opinions carried no real weight in his life. If an emperor with unlimited resources still had to fight this battle inside his own head, it is worth taking seriously as something universal rather than personal. What these 3 rules share underneath the surface is a single idea, stated 3 different ways. Every time you chase, beg, or explain more than necessary, you are quietly handing your own sense of worth to someone else to hold, trusting them to hand it back to you eventually in the form of approval, love, or acceptance. Silence, real silence, the kind these 3 rules point toward, is simply the discipline of refusing to hand that worth away in the first place, keeping it exactly where it belongs, inside you, regardless of who is watching or how they respond. It helps to notice how early in life most people first learn to do the opposite of all 3 rules, because almost nobody arrives at chasing, begging, and explaining as an adult decision made from a place of calm reflection. A child who learns that affection arrives only after enough good behavior, enough achievement, enough visible effort, grows into an adult who instinctively chases approval the same way. A child who learns that needs expressed plainly get ignored, but needs expressed through enough pleading eventually get met, grows into an adult who instinctively begs rather than simply asks. A child who learns that decisions get questioned and picked apart unless defended thoroughly enough in advance, grows into an adult who instinctively over-explains before anyone has even objected to anything. None of these patterns are character flaws. They are simply old survival strategies, learned honestly in earlier, more vulnerable years, that quietly outlived their usefulness long after the situations that created them had already changed. Let's begin. Never chase. There was a merchant named Aldrich who spent the first half of his career chasing every single customer who so much as glanced at his stall without buying anything. He would call after them down the street, lower his prices on the spot the moment someone hesitated, follow potential buyers halfway across the market square explaining why his goods were worth their coin. Business was inconsistent, exhausting, and somehow, despite all that effort, never quite thriving. His wife used to watch him come home each evening more drained than the day before, having chased dozens of customers for hours and often ending the day with less profit than the merchants beside him who simply sat calmly behind their stalls and let people come to them. An older trader who had known Aldrich's father took him aside one afternoon after watching him chase a customer nearly 2 full blocks. He told him something simple. He said a stall that chases looks desperate, and desperate stalls get haggled down to nothing, while a stall that simply waits, confident in its own goods, gets paid full price by customers who convinced themselves they wanted it all along. Aldrich argued at first, insisting that customers needed to be persuaded, that goods didn't sell themselves in a crowded market full of competing voices. The old trader simply pointed across the square at his own stall, quieter, calmer, and consistently busier than Aldrich's despite selling nearly identical goods at higher prices. Aldrich tested the idea reluctantly at first, mostly because nothing else had worked. He stopped calling after people. He stopped following anyone down the street. He simply stood behind his goods, answered questions when asked, and let people walk away if they walked away. The first week felt like watching money disappear in front of him, customers he was certain he could have convinced now simply wandering off. He nearly abandoned the experiment entirely by the 5th day, convinced the old trader's advice had cost him a week's income for nothing. But by the 2nd month, something had shifted that he didn't fully expect. The customers who did stop were staying longer, asking more questions, buying more than they originally intended, because his calm certainty read as confidence in his own product rather than desperation to unload it. Within a year, his stall had become one of the most respected in the entire market, known specifically for the fact that the merchant never once had to convince anyone of anything. There was a particular afternoon, roughly a year into the new approach, that Aldrich always described as the moment the lesson truly settled into his bones rather than just his behavior. A wealthy buyer, the kind who could have purchased his entire stock in a single transaction, stood examining his goods for nearly 10 minutes without saying a word, clearly weighing whether the prices were fair. The old Aldrich would have filled every second of that silence with justification, with comparisons to other merchants, with small discounts offered preemptively to sweeten the deal. The new Aldrich simply continued arranging his other goods, glancing up occasionally with a polite nod but offering nothing more. The buyer eventually approached him directly, remarking that he appreciated a merchant who didn't feel the need to sell him on something he could clearly see the value of for himself, and proceeded to buy considerably more than he had originally intended, at full price, specifically because the silence had communicated a confidence no amount of persuasion ever could have. The Stoics understood this principle long before Aldrich ever set up a single stall. Epictetus taught that chasing anything outside your control, someone's attention, someone's approval, someone's decision to buy or stay or love you, is a losing game by definition, because the moment your peace depends on someone else's choice, you have handed away the only thing that was ever truly yours. Chasing announces, without a single word, that you believe you need the thing you're chasing more than it needs you, and people, whether customers or friends or lovers, can feel that imbalance instantly, even when they can't name it. The moment you stop chasing, you don't lose power. You finally locate it, sitting exactly where it had been the entire time, inside you rather than inside whatever you were running after. There was a second story that grew directly out of Aldrich's own life, involving his daughter years later. She fell in love with a young man in the village who kept her at arm's length, warm one week and distant the next, never quite committing to anything real. She spent months chasing his attention the way her father once chased customers, showing up uninvited, sending messages he rarely answered, growing smaller and more anxious with every unreturned gesture. Friends who watched this unfold said it was painful, the way she seemed to shrink a little more each week, apologizing for wanting basic consistency, rearranging her own plans around the small chance he might finally decide to show up. Aldrich finally told her the same lesson the old trader had once given him, adapted for an entirely different kind of marketplace. He said a person worth having does not need to be chased into wanting you, and a person who does need chasing was never going to make you happy even if you caught them, because the chase itself would simply become the permanent condition of the relationship rather than a phase that ended once you'd proven yourself. She stopped reaching out entirely, not out of spite, simply out of the same quiet dignity her father had learned in the marketplace decades earlier. The first 2 weeks of silence were, by her own account, some of the hardest of her life. The urge to send one more message, to check one more time whether he'd noticed her absence, nearly unbearable some evenings. She held to it anyway. Within 2 months, the young man, suddenly faced with her genuine absence instead of her constant pursuit, showed up at her door asking where she had gone. She told him, calmly, that she was done chasing anyone, and that if he wanted to be part of her life, he would need to start showing up the way she once had. He did, and years later they married, but she always said the marriage only became possible the exact moment she stopped chasing it, because the version of him that finally showed up on her doorstep was a version that had never existed while she was doing all the pursuing. She told her own daughter this story decades later, adding a detail she said she'd never shared with anyone else before, not even her husband. In the 2 months of silence after she stopped reaching out, she said she had genuinely believed, most days, that she had lost him permanently, that her father's advice had cost her the relationship rather than saved it. She kept to the silence anyway, not because she was confident it would work, but because she had simply run out of energy to keep chasing and decided, almost out of exhaustion rather than wisdom, to see what would happen if she stopped. She said it was important for her daughter to understand that part clearly, that the courage to stop chasing rarely feels like courage while you're living through it. It usually just feels like giving up, right up until the moment it turns out to have been the opposite. The third piece of this rule is the hardest one, because it applies not just to people but to opportunities themselves. There was a young architect named Petra who spent years chasing prestigious firms that showed no real interest in hiring her, sending endless applications, following up obsessively, taking every rejection as evidence she simply hadn't tried hard enough yet. She kept a running list of every firm that had ignored her, revisiting it every few months to send another round of applications, treating each silence as a problem she could eventually solve through sheer persistence rather than a clear answer she was refusing to accept. A mentor eventually told her something that reframed the entire chase. He said an opportunity that has to be begged into existence rarely turns into the opportunity you actually wanted once you finally get it, because a firm that only hires you after being worn down by persistence usually treats you exactly the way that persistence suggested you'd accept being treated, as someone grateful for scraps rather than someone bringing real value to the table. Petra stopped chasing the firms that ignored her and instead spent that same energy building an independent portfolio nobody could ignore, taking on smaller, unglamorous projects that at least let her build something real instead of another polished application destined for another silent inbox. 2 years later, one of the very firms that had never once responded to her applications reached out directly, having seen her independent work circulating among people they respected, offering her a position with terms far better than anything she would have accepted out of desperation years earlier. She said the strangest part of the entire experience was realizing that the version of her career built, while she'd stopped chasing, had become, without her fully noticing, more impressive than anything the chasing had ever produced. Petra kept a specific memory from that period that she said stayed with her longer than almost anything else from those 2 years. During one of the smaller, unglamorous projects she took on after giving up on the prestigious firms, a client's teenage daughter, curious about architecture, asked Petra how she'd ended up designing modest homes instead of the towering city buildings the girl had assumed all architects dreamed of. Petra found herself explaining, almost by accident, that she had once believed those towering buildings were the only measure of success worth chasing, and that she had spent years exhausted by that chase before finally discovering that the quieter, steadier work sitting right in front of her had its own value entirely independent of whether anyone prestigious noticed it. She said it was the first time she'd said that thought out loud, and hearing it spoken made her realize how completely she'd already stopped needing the validation she'd once believed she couldn't live without. There is a broader pattern hiding underneath all three of Aldrich's stories, one worth naming plainly before moving on. Chasing, whether it's a customer, a lover, or a job opportunity, always operates on the same flawed assumption that enough visible effort will eventually convince someone or something to want you that didn't already want you to begin with. It rarely works that way. What chasing actually does, almost every time, is confirm to the other party that they hold all the leverage, because you've already shown them, through your own behavior, exactly how much you're willing to sacrifice for something they haven't even agreed to give you yet. The old trader's advice to Aldrich, stripped down to its simplest form, applies just as well to love, to careers, to friendships, to almost anything worth having in life. The things worth having tend to notice you on their own, once you stop making noise trying to drag their attention toward you by force. Never beg. There was a young man named Cohen who grew up believing that love meant proving yourself worthy of it, over and over, no matter how many times the proof went unacknowledged. In his first serious relationship, he apologized for things that weren't his fault, agreed to plans he didn't want simply to avoid conflict, and constantly sought reassurance from a partner who rarely offered any without being asked. Friends who watched this unfold said it was painful to witness, A genuinely good man slowly making himself smaller and smaller in an attempt to earn affection that should have been given freely in the first place. He kept a kind of internal ledger, tallying every kind thing he'd done recently as evidence he'd earned enough goodwill to deserve basic warmth in return. As though love were a debt that needed to be paid down through constant installments rather than something simply given between two people who cared about each other. An older cousin, someone who had been through a similarly draining relationship years earlier, finally sat him down and told him something blunt. She said begging for love doesn't create love, it only confirms to the other person that they no longer have to offer it freely, because you've already shown them you'll stay and beg for scraps regardless. She told him about her own past relationship, one where she had spent nearly 3 years apologizing for needs that were never unreasonable, until a friend finally pointed out that she had trained her own partner, through sheer repetition, to expect apology instead of equality as the default condition of their relationship. Cohen ended that relationship not long after, and the process of rebuilding his sense of self took considerably longer than the relationship itself had lasted. He described the change, once it finally settled in, as one of the strangest sensations of his life, this quiet realization that he had spent years assuming his own worth needed to be constantly re-earned through effort and apology, when in reality the people who actually valued him had never once required any of that from him. He noticed it most clearly in his friendships during that period, the way his closest friends had never once made him feel like he needed to prove himself worthy of their time, and the contrast between those easy, unconditional friendships and the anxious, transactional feeling of his old relationship became impossible to ignore once he finally saw it clearly. There was a specific evening during that rebuilding period that Cohen said marked a real turning point, though it seemed unremarkable at the time. A close friend canceled plans on short notice, something that would have once sent him into a spiral of anxious wondering about what he'd done wrong, whether the friendship was cooling, whether he needed to reach out and smooth things over immediately. Instead, he noticed himself simply feeling mildly disappointed and then moving on with his evening, without a single anxious thought chasing the cancellation into something larger than it actually was. He said that ordinary, forgettable evening was the first time he realized the old anxious pattern had actually started to loosen its grip, not because he'd forced himself to stop caring, but because he'd finally internalized, somewhere beneath conscious thought, that one friend's canceled plans said nothing at all about his own worth. His next relationship, years later, was almost unrecognizably different. He offered warmth freely, but he stopped performing for approval, stopped over-explaining his feelings in the hope of extracting reassurance, stopped treating ordinary disagreements as emergencies requiring immediate resolution through anxious pleading. His partner later said that the thing that first drew her to him was exactly that quality, a man who clearly wanted her but clearly didn't need her permission to feel whole, and that steadiness, rare as it was, felt like the safest thing she had ever experienced in a relationship. She said most of the men she dated before him had either needed constant reassurance or offered none at all, and Cohen was the first person who seemed to have found some steady middle ground, present and warm without ever feeling like he was begging to be kept. Marcus Aurelius wrote often about the trap of needing anything from outside yourself in order to feel complete, reminding himself that a person who has built their sense of worth on something as unstable as another person's mood or attention has built their entire peace on ground that was never solid to begin with. Begging, in any form, whether for love, for a job, for a friend's attention, for a stranger's approval, is really just an announcement that you believe your worth is currently sitting in someone else's hands rather than your own, and people respond to that announcement exactly the way you'd expect. Not with more respect. With less. There was a second version of this same lesson that showed up in Cohen's professional life a few years later. He had been passed over for a promotion he genuinely deserved, and his first instinct was to go to his manager and plead his case at length, listing every reason he was owed the position, essentially begging to be recognized for work that should have spoken for itself. He had already drafted, in his head, an entire speech about his contributions over the past year, rehearsing it in the shower, in the car, anywhere he had a spare moment, preparing to make his case as forcefully as possible. A colleague, watching him prepare for that meeting, stopped him and asked a simple question. She asked whether he had ever seen anyone respected more after begging for something than before they started. He sat with that question for a long moment and realized, uncomfortably, that he hadn't, not once, in his entire career. He cancelled the meeting. Instead, he simply continued doing excellent work, visibly and consistently, without a single word of complaint about the missed promotion, trusting that the work itself, over time, would say what he had been prepared to beg for someone else to notice. 6 months later, when a second opportunity opened up, his manager offered it to him directly, unprompted, later admitting that watching him handle the earlier disappointment with quiet dignity rather than desperate pleading had been the deciding factor, since it demonstrated exactly the kind of composure the more senior role actually required. Cohen said the strangest part of that entire experience was how much smaller the earlier disappointment felt in hindsight, once the second opportunity arrived. In the moment, being passed over the first time had felt catastrophic, evidence that his work simply wasn't valued the way he believed it should be. He said if he had gone through with the original meeting and begged his case, and if that begging had somehow succeeded in winning him the position anyway, he would have spent the rest of his time in that role wondering whether he'd actually earned it, or simply argued his way into it. The version where the offer came unprompted, months later, left no such doubt behind it. The third layer of never begging is perhaps the most private one, because it happens entirely inside your own head before it ever reaches another person. There was a widow named Thessaly who, in the years after her husband's death, found herself constantly begging fate itself for relief, praying in a tone that felt less like faith and more like desperate negotiation, promising anything if only the grief would lighten, bargaining with a universe that had no terms to offer in return. She said those months felt like living in a permanent state of pleading, addressed to no one in particular, exhausting in a way that had nothing to do with physical effort and everything to do with the sheer emotional weight of constantly asking for something that never arrived. A friend who had lost her own husband years earlier told Thessaly something that eventually changed her entire relationship with her own suffering. She said begging the universe for a different outcome than the one you've already been handed keeps you chained to the exact pain you're trying to escape. Because every act of begging is really just another refusal to accept what has already happened. Acceptance, she said, wasn't giving up. It was the only door that actually led back out. Thessaly asked her friend, during that same conversation, how she was supposed to simply stop begging for something as enormous as her husband's return, as though acceptance were a decision she could make once and be finished with. Her friend told her it wasn't a single decision at all, but something closer to a practice, repeated daily, sometimes hourly in the beginning. Each time the old bargaining thoughts arose, promising anything to any listening force in exchange for a different past, the practice was simply noticing the thought without following it all the way down, gently returning attention to whatever was actually true in that moment instead. Some days that meant noticing the bargaining and immediately falling into it anyway. Other days, slowly, it meant catching herself earlier and earlier, until the bargaining thoughts still arrived but no longer swallowed entire afternoons the way they once had. Thessaly said the shift, once it finally came, wasn't dramatic or sudden, more like slowly setting down a weight she'd been carrying without realizing how heavy it had become, until one ordinary morning she noticed her chest didn't feel quite as tight as it had the day before, and she understood, without anyone telling her, that she had finally stopped begging and started, quietly, living again. There is something worth pausing on across all three of these stories: Cohen's romantic life, his career, and Thessaly's grief, because begging shows up in far more places than most people realize once they start looking for it honestly. It is present anytime you find yourself over-apologizing for something that wasn't your fault, anytime you find yourself agreeing to terms you don't actually want simply to avoid someone's disappointment, anytime you catch yourself rehearsing a case for why you deserve something that should never have required a case in the first place. The common thread running through every one of these situations is the same quiet, mistaken belief that your worth is currently on trial and needs to be argued for successfully before anyone will grant it to you. It never actually was on trial. It only felt that way because begging convinced you it needed to be. Never explain. There was a widowed innkeeper named Fenric who made a decision, decades into running his establishment, to stop justifying every choice he made to guests who questioned him. Early in his career, a complaint about pricing, about house rules, about the hour breakfast was served, would send him into long, anxious explanations, detailing every reason behind every decision as though he owed each guest a full accounting of his reasoning. He would stand at the front desk for 10, sometimes 15 minutes, walking a single frustrated guest through the entire logic of his pricing structure, hoping that a thorough enough explanation might finally win their approval and end the complaint. It rarely worked. Guests who received the longest explanations often seemed the most emboldened to keep arguing, as though each additional sentence of justification was an invitation to negotiate further. He noticed something strange over the years. The more he explained himself, the less respect guests seemed to have for his authority in his own establishment, as though each explanation was quietly communicating that his rules were negotiable if someone pushed hard enough for a good enough reason to bend them. An old friend, a fellow innkeeper from a neighboring town, gave him advice one evening that reshaped how he ran his business for the rest of his career. He said the rules of your own house do not require a courtroom defense, they simply require enforcement, calm and consistent, without apology or lengthy justification attached. He told Fenric a story about a guest who had once complained bitterly about a strict checkout time, and how his own refusal to offer any explanation beyond a polite repetition of the rule had ended the argument within 30 seconds. Compared to the 20 minutes it likely would have taken his old, over-explaining self to reach the same outcome. Fenric started answering complaints with short, polite, unexplained responses. Breakfast is served at 7. That is simply the hour. No lengthy reasoning about kitchen staff schedules or supply deliveries, just the fact itself, stated plainly and left to stand on its own. Guests who once would have argued for another 20 minutes found themselves with nothing to push against, no thread of justification to pull on and unravel, and the arguments simply stopped happening almost entirely. His staff noticed the shift too, remarking that the entire front desk felt calmer, less like a daily negotiation and more like a place where clear rules were simply, quietly enforced. Seneca wrote extensively about the exhausting habit of over-explaining yourself to people who have already decided what they think of you regardless of what you say. He argued that a person secure in their own decisions rarely feels compelled to defend them at length to every passing critic, because the explanation itself is often less about informing the other person and more about seeking their approval, a subtle form of begging wearing the disguise of reasonable conversation. Fenric's guests, once he stopped explaining himself so thoroughly, began describing him with a very specific word that had never come up before: respected. Not because his rules had changed at all, because his relationship to his own rules had changed completely. His staff eventually adopted the same approach themselves, something Fenric said he was quietly proud of long after he'd retired. A young clerk who once apologized profusely to guests over the smallest inconveniences, a late delivery, a room not quite ready at the promised hour, gradually began offering the same kind of calm, brief acknowledgement Fenric had modeled for years rather than the anxious over-explanation she'd started with. Fenric said watching that shift happen in someone else, rather than just in himself, was what finally convinced him the principle was real rather than some personal quirk that happened to work for him specifically. It wasn't about his particular personality. It was simply what happens, reliably, whenever someone stops treating their own reasonable decisions as though they require a jury's approval before standing. There was a second dimension of this that showed up in Fenric's private life as well, specifically in how he handled his own decision, later in life, to sell the inn and retire to a quieter town along the coast. Neighbors and old friends peppered him with questions about the decision, some genuinely curious, some quietly judgmental, assuming he was making a mistake by giving up something he'd built over an entire career, questioning why a man in seemingly good health would walk away from something so successful. The old Fenric would have sat down with each of them individually, walking through his full reasoning, hoping to win their approval for a decision that was, ultimately, entirely his to make, drafting mental justifications for every possible objection before anyone had even raised one. Instead, he simply told people the decision was made, thanked them for their concern, and changed the subject. A few pressed harder, clearly expecting the fuller explanation he would once have offered, and he simply repeated the same calm, brief answer each time rather than expanding it under pressure. Several old friends admitted afterward that his calm refusal to justify himself had actually made them trust the decision more than a lengthy explanation ever would have, because it read as a man who was completely certain rather than a man still seeking permission, someone who had made peace with his choice long before anyone else got the chance to weigh in on it. The third layer of never explaining touches something even more private, the habit of over-explaining your own silence itself, apologizing for needing space, justifying at length why you didn't respond to a message right away, treating your own need for quiet as something requiring a formal defense. There was a schoolteacher named Wilhelmina who spent years apologizing profusely any time she needed a weekend alone, crafting elaborate excuses to friends and family rather than simply saying she needed rest, inventing minor obligations or half-true reasons because the plain truth, that she simply wanted quiet, felt somehow insufficient on its own. As though it needed to be dressed up in something more acceptable before anyone would grant it to her. A therapist she eventually saw pointed out something she had never considered. Every apology for taking space was quietly teaching the people around her that her own need for quiet was somehow a debt she owed an explanation for, when in reality, rest and privacy require no justification to anyone at all. The therapist asked her a simple question that stuck with her for years afterward, whether she required her closest friends to explain their own need for a quiet weekend with the same thoroughness she felt obligated to provide, and Wilhelmina realized immediately that she never did, that she extended everyone else the grace of simple, unexplained rest while withholding it entirely from herself. She began simply saying she needed a quiet weekend, nothing more, no elaborate excuse attached, and found to her surprise that most people accepted it immediately and without complaint, because the anxious explanation had never actually been necessary in the first place, only the habit of offering one out of old, unexamined guilt. A close friend even told her, months into the change, that the simple honesty felt more respectful than the old elaborate excuses ever had, because it meant Wilhelmina trusted the friendship enough not to need a cover story just to protect her own need for rest. There was one particular exchange, roughly a year into the change, that Wilhelmina said summed up everything the therapist had been trying to teach her. A close friend called to invite her to a gathering on a weekend she had already set aside for herself, and instead of scrambling for an excuse the way she once would have, she simply said she needed the weekend to rest, and would love to see everyone the following week instead. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that used to send Wilhelmina spiraling into anxious over-explaining. Her friend simply said that sounded fair, and the conversation moved on to something else entirely. Wilhelmina hung up the phone and sat in stunned silence for several minutes, struck by how anticlimactic the entire exchange had been compared to the years of dread she used to carry into moments exactly like it. Taken together, Fenrichsen and Wilhelmina's weekends point toward the same underlying truth that Seneca kept returning to throughout his own letters, the idea that explanation, past a certain point, stops serving the listener and starts serving your own anxiety instead. A guest genuinely confused about a policy deserves a brief, clear answer. A guest determined to argue regardless of what you say does not deserve 20 more minutes of your energy spent trying to win them over. A close friend genuinely curious about your well-being deserves honesty. A friend who was never going to accept any answer you gave, short or long, does not deserve an elaborate performance of justification designed to win approval that was never actually available to be won in the first place. Learning to tell the two situations apart, and offering brief honesty to both instead of anxious over-explanation to either, is really the entire skill hiding inside this third rule. There is a version of this entire idea that shows up even in how people carry themselves physically, worth mentioning briefly before returning to the full list of 9 stories. People who chase tend to lean forward, speak quickly, fill every pause with movement or words. People who beg tend to shrink, soften their posture, make themselves physically smaller in the presence of whoever they're hoping to win over. People who over-explain tend to talk with their hands more than necessary, repeat themselves, circle back to points they've already made as though one more repetition might finally land the way the previous ones hadn't. The opposite of all three, the calm stillness that Aldrich, Cohen, and Fenrich each eventually settled into, tends to show up physically too: a straighter posture, a slower pace of speech, a willingness to let a pause simply exist in a conversation without rushing to fill it, The internal shift these 9 people made was never purely mental. It showed up in their bodies just as clearly as it showed up in their choices, and other people, whether they realized it consciously or not, responded to that physical stillness as much as to anything actually said or unsaid. 3 rules. Never chase, because a person who has to be pursued into caring about you was never going to make you happy once caught, and every hour spent chasing is an hour spent proving your own worth is negotiable. Never beg, because begging for love, for approval, for recognition, only confirms to the world that you believe those things live outside your own hands, when the truth is they were always sitting quietly inside you the entire time. Never explain, because a person secure in their own decisions does not need a courtroom's worth of justification to feel at peace with them, and every unnecessary explanation is a small, quiet admission that you're still seeking permission from someone who was never actually entitled to give it. Aldrich the merchant, his daughter who stopped chasing a hesitant young man, Petra the architect who stopped begging closed doors to open, Cohen who learned love doesn't require earning, Thessaly who stopped begging fate for a different past, Fenric the innkeeper who stopped defending his own rules, and Wilhelmina who stopped apologizing for her own need for quiet. None of them were born with this kind of quiet strength. Every single one of them built it the hard way, usually after years of the exhausting alternative had already worn them down enough to finally try something different. It is worth being honest about something before going any further, because none of these 3 rules are actually easy to practice, no matter how simple they sound when stated out loud. The instinct to chase, to beg, to explain, did not appear in any of these people by accident. It usually forms early, often in childhood, out of situations where love or safety genuinely did seem to depend on proving your worth, on begging for attention that wasn't freely given, on explaining yourself thoroughly enough to avoid punishment or disapproval. Unlearning that instinct as an adult, even once you understand intellectually why it no longer serves you, tends to feel deeply uncomfortable at first, sometimes even frightening, because some old, protective part of the mind genuinely believes that letting go of chasing, begging, and explaining will lead to abandonment or rejection rather than to the respect these stories actually describe. That discomfort is worth naming honestly rather than pretending these 3 rules are simple switches anyone can flip overnight. Aldrich nearly quit his experiment in the first week. Cohen's period of rebuilding after his first relationship took considerably longer than the relationship itself. Wilhelmina spent years, not weeks, apologizing before she finally tested the alternative. None of this changed instantly for any of them, and it is unlikely to change instantly for you either. What changed, in every single case, was not the discomfort of practicing the new behavior, which remained real and present for quite a while. What changed was the willingness to sit inside that discomfort anyway, trusting the accumulated evidence of small experiments over the old, anxious assumption that chasing, begging, and explaining were the only things standing between them and total abandonment. There is a particular moment worth understanding clearly, one that shows up in nearly every story like these. It is the moment right after you stop chasing, right after you stop begging, right after you stop explaining, when everything in you screams that you have made a terrible mistake, that the silence you're now sitting in is going to cost you everything you were trying to protect. Aldrich felt it during that first week of watching customers walk away uncontested. Cohen's cousin felt it during her own long process of learning the same lesson years before she ever passed it on to him. That moment of screaming doubt is not a sign you're doing it wrong. It is, almost universally, the exact moment right before the shift actually starts to show itself, the darkest part of the process arriving right before the change it was making room for. Consider, too, why this particular philosophy, built by men who lived 2,000 years ago, still applies so precisely to modern chasing through text messages, modern begging through anxious social media behavior, modern over-explaining through lengthy messages sent to people who never asked for them. The tools have changed completely. The underlying human patterns have not changed even slightly. Epictetus never saw a phone, never watched someone refresh a message thread waiting for a reply, and yet his teaching about the futility of chasing what is not yours to control describes that exact modern behavior with uncomfortable precision. Marcus Aurelius never scrolled through anyone's carefully curated life, And yet his writing about the emptiness of seeking approval from people whose opinions ultimately mean little describes the entire architecture of modern social validation almost exactly. These rules are not ancient relics being awkwardly applied to modern life. They are simply accurate descriptions of a permanent feature of human psychology, one that happens to express itself through whatever tools each era makes available. There is also a distinction worth making clearly, because these three rules are sometimes mistaken for something colder than they actually are. Never chase does not mean never pursue anything you want in life with real effort and genuine care. It means refusing to pursue people or opportunities that have already made clear, through repeated action, that they are not interested, refusing to keep running after closed doors out of stubborn hope rather than honest assessment. Never beg does not mean refusing to ask for things directly and honestly when you genuinely need them. It means refusing to plead, apologize, and diminish yourself in the process of asking, refusing to treat a reasonable request as though it requires groveling to be granted. Never explain does not mean becoming cold, secretive, or unwilling to share your reasoning with people who genuinely deserve to hear it. It means refusing to justify yourself at exhausting length to people who are never going to accept any explanation you offered, refusing to treat your own decisions as though they require a defense attorney every time someone raises an eyebrow. Silence, used this way, is not the absence of power. It is where power was hiding the entire time, underneath all the chasing, all the begging, all the explaining that never actually earned anyone's respect in the first place. Every single person in these 9 stories eventually discovered the same paradox, that the quieter they became about their own worth, the more clearly other people seemed to recognize it. That is not a coincidence, and it is not magic. It is simply what happens when you stop broadcasting insecurity through constant chasing, begging, and explaining, and let your actual actions, steady and consistent over time, speak on your behalf instead. Actions speak in a register that chasing, begging, and explaining can never quite reach, because actions cannot be argued with the way words can, and people trust what cannot be argued with far more than they trust what can. There is one final thread worth pulling before you go, something that ties Aldrich's marketplace, Cohen's relationships, and Fenrichsen together more tightly than it might first appear. In every single story, the turning point never came from some external validation finally arriving to prove the new approach was working. Aldrich didn't stop chasing because customers suddenly started chasing him back, not at first. Cohen didn't stop begging because he received some clear sign it would immediately be rewarded with reciprocal effort. Fenrich didn't stop explaining because guests immediately applauded his new brevity. Every single one of them made the decision to try the new behavior on faith, based on nothing more than someone else's word that it might eventually work, and held to it through weeks or months of genuine uncertainty before any evidence of it working actually arrived. That is worth remembering as you consider trying any of these 3 rules yourself. The relief and the respect these stories describe rarely show up immediately. They show up only after you've held the new behavior steady for long enough that it stops being an experiment and starts being simply who you are. Pick one of the 3 rules. The one that made something in you go quiet just now, listening, the one your own chest tightened around a little as you heard it described, because that reaction is usually the clearest signal of exactly where you've been chasing, begging, or explaining more than you needed to. Start there tomorrow. Not with some dramatic announcement to everyone around you that you're changing. Simply with one small moment, one unsent message you don't chase after sending, one apology you don't offer for a need that required none, one explanation you let go unspoken because the decision was never anyone else's to approve in the first place. And if this actually meant something to you, stay close, because there is more where this came from. Please subscribe for more.